This is Hello Studios Insights. What follows is the audio edition of Corporate Podcast Investment Outlook, 2020 to 2026, prepared by Hello Studios. Why leading industries are doubling down on podcasts and how to win in the next phase. Executive Summary. Over the last 6 years, podcasts have evolved from a niche content channel into a core component of corporate marketing, brand authority, and executive visibility strategies. While early growth was fueled by experimentation and rapid adoption, the industry is now entering a mature, strategic phase. From 2020 to a projected 2026, United States podcast advertising spend has grown from under $1 billion to over $2.5 billion annually, with corporations increasingly shifting budgets toward owned podcasts, branded series, and video-first formats. This growth represents more than just increased spending. It signals a fundamental shift in how organizations approach content marketing, thought leadership, and audience development. The corporate podcast landscape has matured considerably. Early adopters who launched shows between 2018 and 2020 are now seeing compounding returns on their investments. These organizations have built substantive audiences, established their executives as industry authorities, and created content libraries that continue to drive business value years after initial publication. Meanwhile, late entrants are discovering that the barrier to entry isn't technical or financial, it's strategic. Success in 2026 requires a clear understanding of format selection, distribution strategies, and long-term content planning. This white paper synthesizes market data, industry trends, and strategic insights to help organizations navigate the current podcast investment landscape. Whether you're considering launching your first corporate podcast or optimizing an existing show, understanding these dynamics is essential for making informed decisions. This white paper outlines which industries are investing the most in podcasts and why their business models align with long-form content. How corporate podcast spend has evolved from 2020 through 2026, including the shift from advertising to owned media. The difference between performance advertising and branded podcast investments, and when each approach makes sense. What formats are winning in 2026, from executive interviews to documentary-style series. How organizations should approach podcasts as a long-term business asset rather than a marketing campaign. 1. Podcast market growth, 2020 to 2026. Podcasting has experienced sustained growth, even as broader digital advertising markets have fluctuated. The medium's resilience through economic uncertainty and platform changes demonstrates its fundamental value to both audiences and advertisers. The pandemic accelerated podcast adoption, but unlike many pandemic-era trends, podcast consumption has remained elevated. Commute listening declined temporarily, but was replaced by at-home listening during work, exercise, and leisure time. As of 2026, the average podcast listener consumes 8 hours of podcast content per week, up from 6 hours in 2020. United States podcast advertising revenue, according to Interactive Advertising Bureau and PricewaterhouseCoopers, 2020, approximately $842 million. 2021, approximately $1.45 billion. 2022, approximately $1.83 billion. 2023, approximately $1.93 billion. 2024, estimated, approximately $2.16 billion. 2025, estimated, approximately $2.38 billion. 2026, forecast, approximately $2.56 billion. While growth rates have moderated since the post-pandemic surge, the trend is clear. Podcasts have moved from experimental to institutionalized within corporate marketing budgets. The 2020 to 2021 spike represented pent-up demand and pandemic-driven behavior changes. The steadier growth from 2023 onward reflects genuine market maturation and sustainable audience development. Importantly, this spend reflects only advertising. It does not include the substantial investments corporations are making in branded podcast production, estimated at $800 million to $1.2 billion annually across Fortune 500 companies. Internal communications podcasts, increasingly used for employee engagement and company-wide updates. Executive or thought leadership shows, often produced at a premium with professional studios and high-end post-production. Video podcast investments, including dedicated studio build-outs, multi-camera setups, and professional lighting. When these owned media investments are included, total corporate podcast spending likely exceeds $4 billion annually. This represents a significant shift in how organizations allocate marketing and communications budgets, with podcasts now competing directly with traditional public relations, content marketing, and even event budgets. Key market dynamics. Several factors are driving continued investment in corporate podcasting. First, listener demographics remain highly attractive. Podcast audiences skew educated, affluent, and engaged. The medium appeals particularly to decision-makers and professionals, exactly the audiences that business-to-business and premium business-to-consumer brands want to reach. Second, podcast content has exceptional longevity. Unlike social media posts that disappear from feeds within hours, podcast episodes continue to attract new listeners months or even years after publication. Organizations with multi-year podcast archives report that older episodes consistently drive lead generation and brand discovery. Third, the competitive landscape remains relatively open. While some categories are saturated with podcast content, most industries still have room for high-quality, well-produced shows. Organizations that commit to professional production and consistent publishing schedules can still establish category leadership. 2. Industries investing the most in podcasts. Not all industries approach podcast investment equally. Distinct patterns have emerged based on sales cycle length, customer lifetime value, regulatory environments, and the role of trust in purchasing decisions. Understanding these patterns helps organizations benchmark their podcast strategies against relevant competitors and identify untapped opportunities. Tier 1. Consistent, high-value investors. These industries have made podcasting a core component of their marketing and communication strategies. They typically maintain multiple shows, invest in high production quality, and measure success over quarters or years, rather than weeks or months. Financial services. Banks, fintech, insurance, wealth management. Financial services organizations have embraced podcasting more aggressively than perhaps any other vertical. The reasons are structural. Financial products and services require substantial consumer education, purchase decisions involve significant trust, and customer lifetime values can justify years-long marketing investments. Podcasts align with long trust-building cycles. Financial services sales, whether for wealth management, insurance, or commercial banking, rarely happen quickly. Decision-makers consume multiple pieces of content over months before engaging with sales teams. Regular podcast listening creates familiarity and credibility that accelerates these naturally long cycles. Long-form audio and video supports education and credibility. Financial concepts often require explanation. Podcast episodes provide the time and format to break down complex topics, from retirement planning to cryptocurrency investing, in ways that short-form content cannot match. Strong lifetime customer value justifies sustained investment. A wealth management client might represent $50,000 or more in annual revenue over decades. Against these economics, spending $10,000 to $50,000 per episode on a high-quality podcast makes clear financial sense. Use cases. Executive-hosted shows where managing partners or chief investment officers share market commentary and strategic insights. Financial education series that build authority while serving potential customers. Expert interview shows that position the host organization as an industry convener and thought leader. Notable examples include shows from leading banks, insurance companies, and investment firms that regularly appear in top business podcast charts. These organizations treat their podcasts as premium brand assets, often producing companion video content and hosting live podcast events. Healthcare, wellness, and mental health. Clinics, health systems, therapy groups, health tech. Healthcare organizations face unique communications challenges. Medical information is complex, patient decisions are highly personal, and regulatory requirements limit certain types of marketing. Podcasts have emerged as an ideal solution, allowing healthcare providers to educate, build trust, and humanize their services. Podcasts humanize complex and sensitive topics. Health discussions benefit from the intimacy of audio. Patients considering treatment options, managing chronic conditions, or navigating mental health challenges often prefer consuming information through conversational podcasts rather than clinical white papers or impersonal marketing materials. Ideal for storytelling, patient education, and practitioner authority. Healthcare podcasts can feature patient success stories with appropriate consent, practitioner expertise, and evidence-based health information. This combination builds organizational credibility while serving genuine public health education needs. High demand for ethical, compliant long-form content. Healthcare marketing faces strict regulations, particularly around claims and patient privacy. Well-produced podcasts can deliver value to potential patients while maintaining full regulatory compliance, something harder to achieve with shorter, more promotional content formats. Use cases, documentary-style series following patient journeys or exploring specific health conditions. Practitioner-led shows where doctors, therapists, or nurses share evidence-based advice. Patient narrative podcasts that reduce stigma around conditions from cancer to mental health. The mental health space has been particularly active in podcast production, with therapy groups, digital mental health platforms, and wellness companies all launching shows. These podcasts serve dual purposes. They provide genuine public service value while also building awareness and trust for the sponsoring organizations. Business-to-business software as a service and professional services. Cybersecurity, human resources tech, consulting, legal, marketing services. Business-to-business organizations, particularly those selling complex software or professional services, have discovered that podcasts dramatically accelerate sales cycles. The medium allows executives to demonstrate expertise, explain complex topics, and build relationships with potential buyers before formal sales conversations begin. Podcasts shorten trust cycles in complex business-to-business sales. Enterprise software and professional services purchases involve multiple stakeholders, long evaluation periods, and significant investment. When buyers can listen to dozens of hours of content from a vendor's executives before ever filling out a lead form, they enter sales conversations much further along in their decision-making process. Executives use podcasts to establish category leadership. In crowded software-as-a-service markets, differentiation often comes down to thought leadership. Executives who can articulate industry trends, challenge conventional wisdom, and demonstrate deep expertise through podcast content often win deals based on perceived authority rather than feature comparisons. Episodes are reused by sales teams as relationship assets. Business-to-business podcast content doesn't just generate leads, it supports the entire sales process. Sales teams send relevant episodes to prospects, use podcast conversations as meeting agendas, and leverage guest appearances to initiate partner relationships. Use cases: founder-hosted video podcasts that showcase company vision and culture, industry roundtables bringing together multiple executives from non-competing companies, expert panel discussions that position the host company as an industry convener, deep dive product podcasts that serve existing customers while attracting potential buyers. The most successful business-to-business podcasts focus on industry education rather than product promotion. They tackle topics like regulatory changes, market trends, and operational best practices, demonstrating expertise while providing genuine value to listeners, regardless of whether they become customers. Tier 2. High-spend, campaign-driven investors. These industries invest heavily in podcast advertising, but approach the medium more tactically. They tend to favor campaign-based spending tied to specific launches, seasons, or promotional periods, rather than building long-term owned media assets. Arts, entertainment, and media. Heavy spend tied to launches and releases. Studios, streaming platforms, and publishers spend aggressively on podcast advertising around major releases. A tentpole film might generate millions in podcast ad spend over a 4 to 6 week period. Short-term campaigns rather than long-term ownership. Most entertainment podcast spending goes to advertising rather than owned content. While some studios produce companion podcasts for major franchises, the focus remains primarily on paid media. Increasing focus on video podcasts and companion content. As the lines blur between podcast and video content, entertainment companies are experimenting with behind-the-scenes podcasts, cast interview series, and episodic companion shows. Retail, direct-to-consumer, and consumer packaged goods. Performance-oriented, return-on-investment-driven spend. Consumer brands approach podcast advertising with direct response metrics in mind. They track promo code usage, measure conversion rates, and shift budgets based on immediate performance data. Preference for sponsorships and short-run branded series. Rather than building permanent podcast properties, many consumer packaged goods brands sponsor existing popular podcasts or produce limited-run branded content tied to specific campaigns. Less commitment to long-term owned podcasts. While some heritage brands have launched successful owned podcasts, most remain focused on advertising rather than media ownership. The exceptions tend to be brands in categories like outdoor gear, cooking, or wellness, where lifestyle content naturally extends the brand. 3. Branded podcasts versus performance advertising. As the market matures, corporations are making a clearer distinction between renting attention and owning media. This represents one of the most significant strategic shifts in corporate podcasting, the recognition that different objectives require fundamentally different approaches. Performance advertising, buying ad spots on existing podcasts, works well for direct response campaigns, time-limited promotions, and products with short consideration cycles. Branded or owned podcasts serve different purposes: building long-term brand equity, establishing executive authority, and creating reusable content assets. Understanding when to deploy each approach is crucial. Many organizations waste resources by treating branded podcasts like advertising campaigns, expecting immediate conversions, or by using performance advertising when they need long-term brand building. A comparison of performance advertising versus branded or owned podcasts. Performance advertising, short attribution windows, promo codes and direct response, campaign-based budgets, immediate performance metrics, variable spending based on campaigns, rent attention on others' platforms. Branded or owned podcasts, long-term brand equity, executive credibility and thought leadership, content reuse across sales, public relations, recruiting, and investor relations, compounding returns over time, consistent investment in content production, own the audience relationship. 2026. Trend. High-trust industries are increasingly allocating budget to owned podcasts rather than relying solely on ad placements. The economic reasoning is compelling. A $100,000 investment in performance advertising might generate 50 to 100 qualified leads over a 3-month campaign. The same $100,000 invested in a branded podcast, roughly 10 to 15 professionally produced episodes, creates a permanent content library that continues generating value indefinitely. organizations with mature podcast programs report that episodes from their first year of production still drive meaningful lead generation and brand discovery years later. This compounding return on investment fundamentally changes the unit economics of content marketing. When to choose each approach. Choose performance advertising when you have a time-limited offer or promotion. Your product has a short consideration cycle. You need to reach a specific demographic quickly. You're testing message market fit before committing to owned content. Choose branded or owned podcasts when you operate in a high-trust industry requiring long relationship cycles. Executive visibility and thought leadership are strategic priorities. You want content that serves multiple business functions: marketing, sales enablement, recruiting, public relations. You're willing to invest in quality production and commit to consistent publishing. You measure success in quarters or years rather than weeks or months. 4. The shift to video-first podcasting. By 2026, podcasts are no longer audio only. The distinction between podcasts and video content has collapsed, with leading shows now producing full video recordings as standard practice. This shift isn't just about format. It represents a fundamental change in how podcast content is discovered, consumed, and shared. Key changes: YouTube is now a primary podcast discovery platform. More people discover new podcasts through YouTube than through any traditional podcast directory. YouTube's recommendation algorithm, combined with its massive user base, has made it the single most important distribution channel for new podcast launches. Executives expect video as standard. Corporate decision-makers who agreed to be podcast guests now assume video recording is part of the package. This expectation has raised production standards across the industry, with professional lighting, multi-camera setups, and broadcast-quality audio becoming baseline requirements. Short-form clips outperform traditional ads for reach and engagement. The most effective podcast marketing now comes from short-form clips distributed across LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. A single 60-minute episode can generate 15 to 20 clips, each serving as a discovery mechanism for the full episode. The implications for production are significant. Organizations that launched podcasts in 2020 through 2022 with audio-only setups are now retrofitting for video or starting over with video-first approaches. This often means upgrading studio spaces, investing in cameras and lighting, and rethinking set design and visual branding. Winning podcasts today are designed as long-form conversations optimized for both watch and listen experiences. The best shows work equally well as background audio during commutes or as active viewing experiences at desks. Filmed professionally with attention to visual presentation. Lighting, framing, and set design now matter as much as audio quality. Audiences have developed sophisticated expectations around production value. Distributed across YouTube, LinkedIn, and short-form platforms simultaneously. Multi-platform distribution is no longer optional. It's essential for reaching different audience segments and maximizing content return on investment. Audio is no longer the product, visibility is. This shift has profound implications for how organizations approach podcast investment. The question is no longer, should we start a podcast? But rather, do we have the production capability and distribution strategy to compete in a video-first podcast landscape? Production considerations for video podcasts. Organizations investing in video-first podcasts need to consider several production factors that didn't matter in the audio-only era. Studio design now requires careful attention to backgrounds, lighting setups, and visual branding. Many companies are building dedicated podcast studios or partnering with professional studios that offer turnkey recording solutions. The equipment requirements have also increased. While audio podcasts could be produced with modest microphone and mixer setups, video podcasts demand professional cameras, lighting rigs, and often multi-camera switching capabilities. These investments typically range from $15,000 for basic setups to $100,000 or more for broadcast quality productions. Post-production workflows have become more complex as well. Video editing requires more time and specialized skills than audio editing. Organizations must either build internal capabilities or partner with production companies that can handle both recording and post-production at scale. 5. The rise of documentary-style podcasting. A growing subset of organizations are investing in narrative, documentary-style podcasts, particularly in healthcare, education, and mission-driven sectors. This format represents a departure from the interview-based shows that dominate corporate podcasting, offering instead carefully scripted narratives with production values rivaling network documentaries. Documentary podcasts tell stories rather than hosting conversations. They might follow a patient's journey through treatment, chronicle an organization's response to a crisis, or investigate an industry issue through reported journalism. The format requires substantially more production time and expertise, but delivers outsized impact for organizations willing to make the investment. Why this works: higher watch and listen time. Documentary-style content holds attention better than standard interviews. The narrative structure, combined with sound design and music, creates an immersive experience that keeps audiences engaged through entire episodes and across multiple episodes in a series. Stronger emotional connection. Stories move people in ways that conversations about expertise often don't. Documentary podcasts can build deep emotional connections with organizations and their missions, something particularly valuable for healthcare providers, educational institutions, and nonprofit organizations. Greater press and partnership potential. Well-produced documentary podcasts often generate significant media coverage and attract partnership opportunities. The format lends itself to awards, festival submissions, and cross-promotion with other media properties in ways that standard interview podcasts rarely achieve. This format remains underutilized and represents a significant opportunity for brands willing to invest in quality storytelling. Most organizations default to interview formats because they're familiar and relatively straightforward to produce. Documentary-style content requires more upfront investment, but can deliver differentiated positioning in crowded podcast markets. Production requirements. Documentary podcast production differs substantially from interview podcast production. Rather than booking guests and having conversations, documentary teams conduct research, script narratives, record field audio, and layer in sound design. The process more closely resembles documentary filmmaking or investigative journalism than traditional podcast hosting. Timeline expectations also differ. While interview podcasts can be produced and published within days, documentary episodes often take weeks or months to complete. Organizations must commit to longer production cycles and be comfortable with less frequent publishing schedules. The investment is significant. Documentary podcasts typically cost $15,000 to $50,000 per episode, depending on production complexity. However, the content created has exceptional longevity and can be repurposed across multiple platforms and contexts, often justifying the higher initial investment. 6. How corporate podcast budgets are allocated. By 2026, typical corporate podcast budgets are distributed across 4 main categories, reflecting a mature understanding of what it takes to produce and promote successful shows. Organizations that treat podcasts seriously allocate resources not just to production, but to the full content lifecycle, from strategy through distribution and ongoing optimization. Budget category and allocation. Strategy and production, 40 to 50%. Distribution and amplification, 25 to 35%. Repurposing, clips, and short-form video, 10 to 20%. Analytics, optimization, and audience insights, 5 to 10%. Organizations that treat podcasts as content only underperform. Organizations that integrate podcasts into their broader visibility and authority strategy see compounding returns. Breaking down each category. Strategy and production, 40 to 50%. This largest budget allocation covers content planning, guest coordination, studio time, recording equipment, audio and video production, and hosting and publishing costs. Organizations spending less than 40% on production typically struggle with content quality or consistency. Those spending more than 50% often underinvest in distribution, limiting their show's reach and impact. Within this category, successful organizations typically allocate roughly 60% to production execution, recording and editing, and 40% to strategic planning, content calendar development, guest research, and episode planning. The planning component is often undervalued, but critical for maintaining quality and consistency over time. Distribution and amplification, 25 to 35%. The best content reaches limited audiences without strategic distribution. This budget category covers paid promotion, social media management, email marketing, influencer partnerships, and cross-promotional arrangements. Organizations that skimp on distribution typically see minimal growth beyond their existing networks. Effective distribution strategies typically involve a mix of owned, earned, and paid channels. Owned distribution includes email newsletters, company social media, and website integration. Earned distribution comes through guest promotion, press coverage, and organic social sharing. Paid distribution encompasses podcast advertising, social media promotion, and influencer partnerships. Repurposing, 10 to 20%. Video-first podcasting has made content repurposing both more important and more complex. Each episode can generate dozens of derivative content pieces: short-form video clips, quote graphics, blog posts, LinkedIn articles, and email newsletters. This budget category covers the tools and labor required to extract maximum value from each episode. Organizations with mature repurposing workflows often generate 15 to 25 pieces of supplementary content from each podcast episode. This content extends reach, supports search engine optimization efforts, and ensures that different audience segments can engage with podcast content in their preferred formats. Analytics and optimization, 5 to 10%. While the smallest budget category, this investment is crucial for improving performance over time. It covers analytics platforms, listener surveys, competitive research, and the analysis work needed to understand what's working and what needs adjustment. Organizations that ignore analytics often continue producing content that doesn't resonate with audiences or achieve business objectives. Regular analysis of download trends, engagement metrics, and conversion data enables continuous improvement and ensures resources flow toward the most effective content formats and topics. 7. The role of artificial intelligence in corporate podcasting. Artificial intelligence is increasingly used in podcast production, but rarely as the product itself. This distinction is crucial. Organizations that have experimented with fully artificial intelligence-generated podcasts, synthetic hosts, automated content, computer-generated voices, have largely abandoned these approaches after discovering that audiences reject obviously artificial content. Instead, artificial intelligence has found productive applications throughout the podcast workflow, primarily in roles that enhance human creativity and efficiency rather than replacing it. The most successful organizations treat artificial intelligence as a production assistant, not as a host or creative director. High-value applications include research and episode planning. Artificial intelligence tools excel at identifying trending topics, researching potential guests, and summarizing background information. Production teams use artificial intelligence to accelerate the research phase, generating episode outlines and suggesting discussion topics that human producers can refine and expand. Content structuring. Transcript analysis tools can identify the most compelling moments in recorded conversations, helping editors make decisions about episode structure and identifying potential clips for promotion. Clip identification and repurposing. Artificial intelligence can scan hour-long episodes to identify quotable moments, compelling exchanges, and segments likely to perform well as short-form content. This dramatically accelerates the repurposing workflow, allowing teams to generate more derivative content from each episode. Caption writing and distribution optimization. Automated transcription has become remarkably accurate, and artificial intelligence can generate social media captions, email copy, and distribution text from episode transcripts. This reduces the manual labor involved in multi-platform distribution. These applications improve efficiency without compromising the human elements that make podcasts compelling. The host's personality, guest chemistry, and authentic conversation remain irreplaceably human. Artificial intelligence simply helps those elements reach audiences more effectively. What corporations consistently avoid artificial intelligence hosts. Audiences can detect synthetic voices and reject them. Even as artificial intelligence voice technology improves dramatically, listeners continue to prefer authentic human hosts. Organizations that have experimented with artificial intelligence hosts report significantly lower engagement and completion rates. Fully automated podcasts. End-to-end automated podcast production. Artificial intelligence-generated scripts, synthetic voices, automated editing, consistently produces content that feels hollow and fails to build audience loyalty. The lack of genuine personality and authentic perspective undermines the fundamental value proposition of podcasting. Low trust, low touch production. Organizations in high trust industries, financial services, healthcare, professional services, universally avoid artificial intelligence generated content in their podcasts. These industries depend on authentic expertise and personal credibility, elements that artificial intelligence cannot replicate or substitute. In mature markets, artificial intelligence is an operational advantage, not a selling point. Organizations that successfully integrate artificial intelligence into their podcast workflows rarely mention it publicly. They understand that audiences don't care about production techniques. They care about content quality, host credibility, and the value they derive from listening. The future of artificial intelligence in podcasting. Looking ahead, artificial intelligence capabilities will continue improving, particularly in areas like real-time translation, enabling global distribution, accessibility features, automated transcription and description, and personalized episode recommendations. These applications enhance podcast reach and accessibility without compromising the authentic human elements that make podcasting effective. The key insight: artificial intelligence works best in podcasting when it's invisible to the audience. Tools that help production teams work faster, distribute more effectively, and optimize performance deliver clear value. Applications that attempt to replace human hosts or generate synthetic content consistently underperform and risk damaging brand credibility. Conclusion: the 2026 podcast opportunity. Podcasting in 2026 is no longer about experimentation or chasing virality. It is about authority, trust, and owned media. The organizations that succeed with podcasts today have moved beyond treating them as marketing campaigns or content experiments. They understand that podcasts are strategic assets that compound in value over time. The market has matured considerably since the early growth years. Technical barriers have disappeared. Anyone can launch a podcast with modest equipment and free hosting. Distribution is no longer a challenge. Platforms are actively seeking new content to fill their catalogs. The real barriers now are strategic. Understanding why your organization needs a podcast, what format will serve your objectives, and how to maintain the discipline and quality required for long-term success. The organizations winning with podcasts today operate in high-trust industries where relationship building justifies sustained content investment. Financial services, healthcare, And business-to-business technology companies lead podcast adoption because their business models reward long-term thinking and brand building. Invest in executive voices as strategic assets. The most successful corporate podcasts feature C-suite executives or senior leaders who can speak authentically about industry trends, company vision, and professional expertise. These shows build executive visibility that benefits the entire organization. Prioritize video-first formats that maximize distribution potential. Organizations launching podcasts in 2026 without video capabilities face significant disadvantages in discovery, promotion, and audience growth. Treat podcasts as long-term strategic assets rather than marketing campaigns. This means consistent publishing schedules, quality production standards, and patience to build audiences over quarters and years rather than weeks and months. For corporations seeking credibility, visibility, and durable audience relationships, podcasts are no longer optional, they are foundational. The question is not whether to invest in podcasting, but how to do so strategically, with clear objectives and appropriate resource commitments. Organizations that approach podcasts with this mindset, treating them as owned media properties deserving of strategic investment and professional execution, will build valuable assets that generate compounding returns for years to come. Those that continue treating podcasts as experiments or side projects will struggle to compete in an increasingly sophisticated market. The 2026 podcast opportunity belongs to organizations willing to commit to excellence, consistency, and long-term thinking. The technical and distribution barriers that once limited podcast success have disappeared. What remains is the strategic challenge of building something genuinely valuable for audiences while advancing clear business objectives. About Hello Studios. Hello Studios is a podcast and content agency specializing in end-to-end podcast creation, executive storytelling, documentary-style content, and strategic distribution. We help organizations turn expertise into authority through professionally produced, video-first podcasts designed for long-term impact. Founded in 2020, Hello Studios has produced over 20,000 podcast episodes for more than 500 clients across industries, including financial services, healthcare, technology, and professional services. Our approach combines strategic planning, professional production, and multi-platform distribution to create podcast properties that serve as durable business assets. Whether you're launching your first corporate podcast or optimizing an existing show, Hello Studios provides the expertise, infrastructure, and ongoing support needed to build a successful podcast program. Our Dallas-based studios offer professional recording environments, while our production team handles everything from episode planning through final distribution. For more information about our services, or to discuss your podcast strategy, visit iamhellostudios.com or contact our team directly. This concludes the audio edition of Corporate Podcast Investment Outlook, 2020 to 2026.